Hey, what is going on today, YouTube? Today I'm going to be making a video about a recent podcast that I watched from the Korekara podcast about Anki. This was a recommendation by someone in my Discord group chat, and they told me to go watch it, and I thought they had some pretty key points that are, I had some opinions about, and I'm just going to talk about those today. So first things first, we're going to go a little bit over some of the key points of the podcast, in my opinion, on what Anki is useful for. And yeah, so jumping straight into it, one thing that is brought up in the podcast is this concept called interleaving. And this interleaving concept is basically, if you do a bunch of different skills in a certain subject, you will build a better memory of them and you'll learn better long term. And this is kind of opposed to a blocking method, to where you have a set amount of things that you're going to learn kind of in blocks. So you're going to learn A, then you're going to learn B, and then you're going to learn C, and C. Whereas the interleaving is you mix all three of those together, A, B, C in one session, A, B, C in the next, and A, B, C in the latter session. And so that's just a little quick example of what interleaving is kind of about. And this applies for many different types of skills and isn't just for language learning. And in the context of language learning, it's a little bit of a weird kind of thing, in my opinion. I couldn't really find too much on how to interleave with language that's like concrete, other than you switch topics in the language, you maybe output a little bit, you speak a little bit, and you just do that while consuming the language. And there's going to be a link down below in the description. I'm going to link a YouTube video that I watched a little bit more on what interleaving is about for language learning, and that's by Steve Kaufman, so go give that a watch if you're interested. But yeah, this is one big thing that they Justin brings up in the podcast as one of the most evidence-based ways for learning. But in terms of language learning, I think there are different ways, and applying it to language learning may be a little bit rough, especially for the self-learners. So that's kind of that with the interleaving thing. I'm going to leave it at that before it gets too crazy. And I'm going to jump into the next topic that I think was pretty important about on the podcast, and that is what is the use of Anki and when it should be used. And of course, I think this was the most highly debated part of the podcast, of the discussion. And the two kind of points of it was, should you use Anki for obscure words that you don't really see too often in real life, but you see a lot in literature? Or do you save Anki for those words that you've come across in your quote-unquote interleaving practice, and you just can't really ingrain it into your mind, so you throw it into Anki to brute force it into your memory? I think those are the two kind of major arguments that Justin brought up, the interleaving one, and then Eric brought in the obscure words one. And I think this one kind of depends on, how you're using Anki. So if you just take these weird, obscure words and you try to memorize them in Anki by like a frequency list, and you just throw all those words in and try to do that, brute force that, in my opinion, is not going to work. That doesn't really do too much help, as when I've done this, it's pretty terrible, and it's just, you don't want to be doing Anki when you're doing that. But the way that I kind of see the usage of Anki for these obscure words is, if you come across them, say in your immersion, and you are using this content, you're using this media on a day-to-day basis, so you're repeatedly watching this media, then you can go ahead and throw into Anki, and you'll come across this word quite a bit more artificially, because you're repeatedly watching whatever content you're watching, and your comprehension of it grows, therefore strengthening your memory of that word in that context. So that's how I think you can use Anki for these obscure words. Justin brings up the point that I thought was also pretty good, is that these obscure words only will appear more in your immersion or your content the higher level you get. So if your level, say for example in Japanese, is barely enough to just get you around, you might be able to say a few sentences, there's no way at all that you're ever going to be able to break into higher level conversations where you will see these more obscure words. So Justin's point in this aspect was, continue building that level of Japanese to breach above the beginner level and the basic conversations to reach those higher level conversations. And so I think that is one key way to see these words a lot more in context. But in my opinion, I think you can use the Anki to really help in your immersion studies, especially if you're repeatedly watching the content that you're consuming or repeatedly reading the content that you're consuming, as I think this is probably the better of the sentiment out there, that you should reuse and reread, reconsume the media that you're doing. And so I think this kind of brings up the point of what is in fact the role of Anki. And so I'm going to go a little bit away from the podcast and kind of just talk about what I think about the role of Anki is in the language learning journey as a tool. And based on my experience, and I think, just the opinion of others that I've seen online, is Anki is meant as a supplement tool. It's not actually the learning tool. So if you use Anki as a way to quote unquote learn the language, you're not going to get really far, because you're studying things out of context and you're not really bonding with the language. And so in my experience, Anki is meant to supplement your immersion learning, where you're consuming the content and then making Anki cards based on the content that you're consuming. So in my case, what I like to do is I'll create Anki flashcards for words that I come across in my immersion that I don't really know. But in my experience, or in my case, I watch anime over and over and over, so I keep hearing and I keep seeing these words. And so when I review it in Anki, it passes pretty easily. And so that is one way that I see you can artificially use Anki to supplement your immersion. And this helps a lot because you're actually creating a bond with those words in the context and in the context of how it's being used, so to speak. So you're strengthening your memory for those words. And so that's just the better way to use Anki, rather than a frequency list and just studying a bunch of words out of context. And I think that's one of the big points that Justin brought up, is that when you study words in Anki, quote unquote, out of context, it creates a different understanding of those words than if you see those words in context. Now, I understand that, Anki is a little misused in certain cases. And of course, I think if you're lazy about your Anki, it's going to severely hinder your efficiency with it. And that's why I think, you have to use Anki tactfully in your immersion studies. And it's hard a lot, especially in the beginning, because in my experience, in my beginning part, I've deleted almost like all the cards I made from the beginning of my immersion studies, because a lot of the cards that I was making weren't really that good, so to speak. And so, I feel like using Anki skillfully is a little bit of a learning process, and it's kind of hard to avoid those little traps that you could fall into. And this brings up kind of the point of what is a good range of cards you should be learning in Anki per day. And the number that was brought up in the podcast was 10 from Eric, and Justin said 10 is still kind of a lot. In my opinion, I think 10 is all right, as long as these words you're using, these new words that you're learning in Anki, are cards from the media and content that you're using for your immersion. And so I understand that a lot of people, they don't like to re-watch and reuse their immersion content. In that case, it might be a little bit harder to maybe create new flashcards, but I think it should be used, like these flashcards to be used to supplement your immersion. And that's how you're going to consolidate the meaning and these relationships to these words in the context that they're being used. And jumping back to the podcast, I do think there's one word that is used quite often in there, and it's retrieval. And I think it really depends on what retrieval you're talking about. And the two main ones are recall and recognition. So it seems that Justin was talking more along the lines of the recall of the retrieval aspect, and that means you're able to reproduce the word, you're able to reproduce the meaning, whereas the recognition side of things is where you're able to see the word and understand the meaning, but you aren't really able to recall recall the word from your brain, like if you're trying to speak or if you're trying to write. And so based on studies out there, recognition is much easier than the recall side of things. But I think this point was kind of, I feel like when they were talking about it in the podcast, it felt like they were arguing two different things. One was arguing recognition, one was arguing recall. Maybe that's the way I interpreted it, but I think, Anki is really good for building recognition, whereas recall, it shouldn't really be used for. The recall should be coming from your immersion studies. When you see the word in context, you build that relationship to that word, and you strengthen your memory of that word, and that's how you build your recall of it. And so yeah, I really think Anki should only really be used for the recognition side of things, not really the recall, because that means you're putting too much time into Anki to actively try to recall these words, and that's not efficient in my opinion. And lastly, jumping kind of back to Anki as a tool, as a role of what Anki should be, the role of Anki really should just be a supplement to the learning, to where you're seeing your immersion content in your cards, and that's really where it should be used for recognition, not really the recall side of things, not really for words out of context, and not pre-made decks. And so pre-made decks can, maybe boost your understanding in the language, but that only occurs if you're doing the pre-made decks with the immersion content. As well, I think Japanese is a little bit different because, the involvement of kanji. So I think Anki is also really good for kanji compared to, other languages that use the Romaji alphabet or the Latin alphabet instead. And so that's about it for today's video. That's all I kind of wanted to talk about today because I found that video pretty interesting. The discussion that was brought about is about whether Anki is useful in learning languages. And so I think if you use it in a tactical way, it can be a awesome tool for learning languages. And just like any other tool out there, if you abuse it too much, it's not really that good. So yeah, that's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in a future one.